Hi, welcome to the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio. My name is Andrew Richmond and I'm an antiques and art appraiser. And today we're going to be looking at some of the ceramics here in the Decorative Arts Center's collection. They've got a wide range of ceramics from throughout Europe and America, and we'll look at a few pieces. Typically these ceramics are spread throughout the main floor with the double parlors, the hallway, and the rising room, but we've pulled them all together here to kind of give you an overview of the kinds of things that are here. And we'll talk a bit about the various types and where they're from and how old they are. Some of the earliest pieces here are this Chestnut Basket, and it's got an underplate. And you can see it's really quite amazing in how it's produced with all these very thin parts that were then essentially woven and tied together when it was clay, and then fired and glazed. This is a kind of English ceramic called pearl ware. In pretty much throughout the most of the early European history of ceramics, it was about trying to replicate Chinese porcelain. They didn't have the recipe, and that was the goal, was to get as close to porcelain as they could. One of the ways they did it was by adjusting the glaze. They used a really refined clay that was almost white, and then for this, it was actually kind of a slightly bluish tinged glaze, a clear glaze, but with a slight bluish tinge, and it's called pearl ware. And this was an early attempt to try and mimic Chinese porcelain. You can see it's quite delicate, it's very fragile, and this was made in England probably in the 1790s to about 1800. So this is another piece of English ceramic, and this is moving closer to true porcelain. This is not quite real porcelain. They don't quite have the recipe right, but it's getting there. It's much more thinly made and more delicate. But what's interesting about this is the decoration, and there are two types of decoration. There is the landscape, which is all hand-painted, and then, of course, there's the gilding. And so this is actually a complex process. First, they would shape the vessel out of wet clay, and they would let it dry to what they call leather-hard consistency. And then they would give it an initial fire. That kind of solidifies it as a piece. Then they're going to put the hand-painted decoration, or some of this hand-painted decoration in an overglaze, and then fire it again to solidify all that. And lastly, they're going to take the gilding and put the gilding on, and then give it a third fire. So it's a multi-step process because each thing requires firing at a different temperature, and so you have to fire it 3 different times to make the whole bowl. Again, in Europe, the goal was to mimic or to reproduce Chinese porcelain. And this is about as close as you're going to get in the end of the 18th or just after the turn of the 19th century in Paris. This is a version of porcelain. It's not quite as fine as some of the Chinese porcelain you'll see of that period, but it's pretty darn close. And this could have been made by any one of dozens of factories in and around Paris that were making porcelain. Collectively, they're often called Old Paris or Vieux Paris or Vieux Paris porcelain. Again, it's a collective term to describe dozens of factories. This is called a campagna vase. This particular shape is of the campagna shape. And you've got a range of decorations. You've got hand-painted figures, hand-painted flowers, gilding. And the piece itself is made in 2 pieces. There's the urn and the base, and you can see it's actually bolted together there. And then you have, so these would have been turned on a wheel, and then you have these molded pieces that are applied. So again, it's multiple steps. Every time you do something new to the piece during the process, you have to fire it again to solidify it. So true porcelain did make it to America. Finally, in the 18th century, there were a couple of places where they were able to manufacture it, but it was never quite commercially successful. What is considered the first commercially successful porcelain manufacturing in the United States was in Philadelphia in the 1830s by a man named William Tucker. And this is a piece of porcelain made at that factory. It's a classical shaped pitcher, again with gilding, and these flowers are all hand painted on both sides. So again, multiple steps in the process to get everything solidified and fired over multiple times. Lastly, we're going to jump into the late 19th or maybe even early 20th century with porcelain that are probably either German or Austrian. So this is 100 years after porcelain was being made in this country. So the techniques had been really refined. Actually, in Germany, they had been made since the mid-18th century. So really refined. You can see how delicate and thin some of these pieces are. I mean, it's extremely fragile stuff. All of it's hand-painted. This is the kind of stuff that was produced in Germany and Austria in huge quantities in the Victorian era, late 19th through the early 20th century, and exported throughout the Western world, again in large quantities. And a lot of, at least my great grandmother had some of this stuff in her parlor, but she was growing up in the 19 teens and 20s.